8, the Honourable Member for Carleton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to discuss the cover-up budget, as it's now being called by Canadians. The government introduced a budget with $41 billion of brand new cash spending designed to paper over the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal, a scandal that has engulfed this government ever since the former Attorney General revealed that the Prime Minister and a group around him carried out an intense campaign of political interference, hounding, bullying, and inappropriate pressure in order to convince her to set aside criminal charges on SNC-Lavalin, a company facing over $100 million worth of fraud and bribery charges. Now, when I began my speech, I started by pointing to numerous inconsistencies in the Prime Minister's story on this matter. I want to read a particular quote, one that is central to his defense. He said when the scandal came to light, and after the former Attorney General had resigned in Cabinet over it, he said, and I quote, "If anyone, including the former Attorney General, had issues with anything they might have experienced in this government, or didn't feel that we were living up to the high standards we set for itself, it was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did." End quote. I'll read the last 4 words again. And no one did. Gerald Butts then went before a parliamentary committee and attempted to discredit the former Attorney General, said if she had such concerns about the way we were acting on the SNC-Lavalin prosecution, then why weren't we talking about this in September, in October, in November, in December? The essence of the rhetorical question that the Prime Minister and his top staff have asked is, if she had a problem with our political interference, why didn't she say something? Well, we now know she did. And the Prime Minister's suggestion to the contrary is false. We have here audio recordings in which the former Attorney General said, and I about the Prime Minister's personal interference, she said to the Clerk of the Privy Council, "So, we are treading on dangerous ground here. This is a constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence. It is entirely inappropriate, and it is political interference. Decisions that are made by the independent prosecutors are their decisions. I can't even imagine what the former Supreme Court Justice, Chief of the Supreme Court, feeling in any way, shape, or form comfortable with interfering with the independence of prosecutors. This is about the integrity of the Prime Minister and interference. There is no way that anybody would interpret this other than interference. This is going to look like nothing but political interference by the Prime Minister, by you, by everybody else that's involved in this politically pressuring me to do this. This is about interfering with one of our fundamental institutions. This is like breaching a constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence. It would be deemed political interference in day one. I am trying to protect the Prime Minister from political interference or perceived political interference or otherwise. What I am confident of is that I've given the Prime Minister my best advice to protect him and to protect the Constitution and constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence. Again, she says, this goes far beyond saving jobs. This is about the integrity of the Prime Minister and interference. There is no way that anybody would interpret this other than interference if I was to step in. That is a list of 8, maybe more, warnings that the former Attorney General gave to the Prime Minister's top public servant on December 19th. And yet 2 months later, the Prime Minister had the audacity to go before 35 million Canadians and say, you know, she never once raised a single solitary complaint. Shameful. Never let me know at all that I was doing anything wrong. You know, this conversation, had it not been recorded, would probably be denied right now. I think a lot of Liberals are attacking the former Attorney General for recording that conversation. I think she did so knowing that the Prime Minister and his team would lie and deny if she did not have proof that the conversation occurred. The Prime Minister said he was never warned. But not only is there this extensive audio tape that shows the former Attorney General did warn the Prime Minister's clerk. The clerk made clear during that conversation he would be talking to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister was not going to be happy with all of her refusals to interfere with the criminal prosecution. He's in a mood. He's going to get it done one way or the other. In other words, the expectation all of us get from listening to the audio of that conversation was that the former clerk, the outgoing clerk of the Privy Council, would immediately be bringing the results of the conversation to the Prime Minister. Since he has denied knowing anything about this conversation. This is laughable. Not only was this issue, helping SNC avoid trial, top of mind for the Prime Minister, according to the clerk, he was calling the Attorney General about the issue on behalf of the Prime Minister. In other words, the Prime Minister would have been anxious to hear the results of that conversation. In the last few days, the clerk has come out and said, well, I would have told the Prime Minister about the conversation, but everybody went right on vacation after it was done. Well, it only took a few minutes for the media to check the publicly available records and find out that the Prime Minister was not on vacation the next day or even the day after that. And furthermore, we only have to go back to the clerk of the Privy Council's own testimony before the Justice Committee, wherein he says that anyone in the government can get a hold of the Prime Minister 24/7 just by calling his switchboard. And anybody who's ever used that switchboard will know it is a magnificently powerful tool. It can find people anywhere they might be hiding, including on vacation. But we are left to believe that 2 months went by from the time that the clerk had this menacing conversation with the Attorney General, all the way to February 15th, when the Prime Minister would step out in front of 37 million Canadians and deny knowledge of any objections from the former Attorney General, that all that time would have gone by, and not once would the clerk of the Privy Council go to his boss and say, by the way, I did speak to the Attorney General as you asked, and she gave me more than a half a dozen very clear warnings that what we were doing is wrong. I find it hard to believe that that conversation did not take place. Now, the Prime Minister claims that, it's all just a breakdown in communications, an erosion of trust. Well, this is an area where I will agree with the Prime Minister. When you look 37 million Canadians in the eye and you tell them something that is not true, an erosion of trust is an understatement. Yeah. Now, let me just point to another one of these contradictions we witness here in the Prime Minister and his top staff and their interventions. Gerald Butts testified about the meeting that he and Katie Telford had with the Chief of Staff to the Attorney General. This conversation was important because it is recorded in the Attorney General's notes that top PMO staff were using very aggressive language to try and convince her to get the Attorney General to shelve those criminal charges on SNC-Lavalin. And Gerald Butts speaks of that meeting defensively. He said, that second and final meeting I had on the file was with Jessica Prince, the minister's chief of staff, and Katie Telford. There was no urgency to attend the meeting. I remember that meeting very, very differently from the account given last week. So let me repeat that. There was no urgency to attend the meeting, he says. Well, that's funny, because PMO staffer emailed Ms. Prince, and the subject line in the email is urgent. Chat with Katie and Jerry. So, you might on the surface of it say, that's not really terribly important, whether a meeting was urgent or not urgent. But when lies are thrown around like snowflakes, and and statements are just expected to melt away and then evaporate into thin air, you come to the conclusion very quickly that you can't believe anything that the Prime Minister and the people around him claim. That he specifically chose the sentence, there was no urgency to attend that meeting.
Yeah.
And then in the subject line to the meeting's invitation, urgent.
It's crazy.
Chat with Katie and Jerry. And then furthermore it says, Katie and Jerry would like to speak to you ASAP, before 5 p.m. today. Email sent at 4:16. So that's not urgent at all.
Not urgent.
I need to see you before 5, but that's okay. It's only 4:16.
Yeah.
In other words, drop everything. And did we mention it was urgent? You wonder why, with all of the things that Mr. Butts could have said before committee, he would specifically say something that is demonstrably false and easily disprovable in the documentary evidence. I mean, it's as though he thought he could sit in that committee and state falsehood after falsehood because no one would be able to know what was true or untrue, that it was just a he said, she said.
Yeah.
The problem for Gerald Butts and the Prime Minister is that they were dealing with someone who was punctilious in keeping records. And when people have records, it's hard to lie about what happened. And we're seeing that in this example and in many others. Back to the claim the Prime Minister knew nothing of the Attorney General's concerns about his political interference. On September 18th, the Attorney General met with the Prime Minister and said, she says of that meeting, I looked him in the eye and asked, are you interfering with my role as Attorney General? Because I strongly advise against it. That was in September. And yet the Prime Minister stood up in February and said, I didn't know anything about her concerns. She never mentioned it to me. It's funny, We walk past each other in the hallway every day and she didn't think to mention it. Well, we see one piece of documentary evidence after another showing that the Prime Minister stated blatant falsehoods. Now we'll move on to the next falsehood, one that the government, that numerous members of the government repeatedly stated in their efforts to secure a deferred prosecution agreement for SNC-Lavalin. And that is this claim that the headquarters of the company would imminently announce its departure from Montreal if the Attorney General did not immediately indicate her willingness to negotiate a deferred prosecution agreement. The Prime Minister, the Clerk of the Privy Council, and the Attorney General met in late September. And at that meeting, the Attorney General reports that they told her that before the Quebec election even happens, the company would announce it's moving its headquarters unless she were to initiate a deal to shelve the prosecution. The Quebec election was only 2 weeks away. In other words, if she were to have believed what they said, she would have been under the mistaken impression that she had to make this decision immediately in order to avoid losing a major corporate headquarters. Well, It turned out that threat was totally false, as borne out by the fact that we all see they haven't moved their headquarters. But furthermore, the company has signed an agreement with the Quebec Pension Plan that in exchange for a $1.5 billion loan, the headquarters will remain in Montreal till at least the year 2024, where, by the way, it has signed a 20-year lease and announced a multi-million-dollar renovation to accommodate its thousands of employees there. That doesn't sound like the actions of a company that's about to get up and move its headquarters. So that statement that they made to her about the immediate need for her to act to save the headquarters was utterly false. You know, lying to a prosecutor or to a top law officer in order to shelve criminal charges may well violate Section 139 of the Criminal Code, which makes it an offense to attempt to obstruct, pervert, or defeat the course of justice. I mean, telling a law officer a lie in order to get charges shelved sounds to me like you're obstructing, perverting, or defeating the course of justice. Yet that is exactly what happened. And then I came to the House of Commons to ask the Prime Minister about this falsehood, and he denied ever having stated it. But now, I wasn't in the room for that September meeting, so I couldn't tell you what was said there. But we do have scrupulous notes from the Attorney General, and we do have the fact that the Prime Minister went into the press theater and repeated exactly the same falsehood in several months later. He publicly went on the record and said the headquarters might leave if the company did not avoid prosecution. And so what the Attorney General claims the Prime Minister said in that meeting was the same as what he then went out and said publicly. In other words, he has been peddling this falsehood in both private and in public. You know, I'm not surprised, though, that the Prime Minister didn't remember that he had said it, because it's much harder to remember what you say if you're not telling the truth. Yeah. You know, when you tell the truth, you just have to hearken back to what actually happened. When you're telling falsehoods, your memory has to keep track of a whole multiplicity of different versions of events. And that's why the Prime Minister is having such a difficult time keeping his story straight. Now, I will note, Mr. Speaker, that I am prepared to cede the floor. Right now, if the members across the way will rise and commit that the Justice Committee will resume its investigation into the SNC-Lavalin scandal. Yeah. And now the Prime Minister has shut down the Justice Committee investigation, has shut down the Ethics Committee. It's a Justice Committee with no justice and an Ethics Committee with no ethics. Yeah. But we can fix all of that here and now if the Prime Minister will rise and give his word that...
Point of order, the member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Canadians are seized with how critical this topic is that we're discussing, and it's very difficult to hear in the room because of all the chatter that's happening on the far side of the room. I would ask you to bring the House to order, please.
It's the honourable member for Timmins James Bay has a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I was listening very closely to my honourable colleague, but I'd never heard him mention the word budget, so I was just asking, and perhaps I didn't hear it. I had to reach over to my good friend from Prince Edward Island to say whether or not the word budget, because he has such extensive experience, and then he was responding back that he hadn't heard the word budget, and I know we're going to hear the word budget, so I think that was just the exchange that happened, but there was no disrespect for the member from Carleton, and I'm more than interested in what he has to say, so thank you, Speaker.
Before the honourable member for Carleton continues, I was going to interrupt at some point just for a short time. I have some housekeeping to do. Order. It's my duty, pursuant to Standing Order 38, to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona, Canada Post Corporation. The honourable member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke, Veterans Affairs.
The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier, Finance.
And now I'll let the honourable member for Carleton continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And thank you. I did mention the word budget at the very outset of my remarks, and I realize that this is a very large chamber with imperfect acoustics, and the NDP does sit very, very, very far down the way, and sometimes my voice, as delicate as it is, does not travel that far. I have a tendency also to turn to my right when I speak, and therefore those to my left often don't hear what I'm saying. But back to the subject at hand. The subject at hand, of course, is the cover-up budget. And the government, the Prime Minister has introduced $41 billion of new cash spending, money he's splashing all over the land, far and wide, hoping that he distracts Canadians from the SNC-Lavalin scandal with their own money. I have said it before, but I will say it again. This is the Kathleen Wynne three-step.
That's right.
Step number one, massive scandal. Step number two, massive deficit spending to cover it all up. And step number three, massive tax increases to pay for it all after the election. That's exactly what they've got planned here. They're now into step two. But I believe if we lay out the facts of the case about this scandal and the corruption, in addition to the outrageous tax and spend policies of the government, Canadians will choose differently in October, and the Liberals will not have a chance to carry out step number three. So that is the case that we are making here today. So I was speaking earlier about this falsehood that the Prime Minister was trying to save the headquarters of SNC-Lavalin. I've just finished disproving that claim altogether. As I was saying earlier, the company's headquarters can't leave because of a $1.5 billion loan agreement with the Quebec Pension Plan that keeps the company HQ in Montreal until 2024, and that the company is in the process of renovating its headquarters there to accommodate its thousands of employees in a building on which it has just signed a 20-year lease. In other words, it did all of this knowing that it would be prosecuted, knowing that it was not getting a deferred prosecution agreement, and the Prime Minister's threat to the Attorney General that the headquarters would leave if she didn't intervene and offer a special deal was absolutely and totally false. Furthermore, when asked before the Justice Committee what evidence he had for this claim that 9,000 jobs would vanish unless the charges, SNC charges, were shelved, Gerald Butts said, and I quote, "Nothing specific. No specific evidence." So he'd sat there for hour after hour and made this claim that 9,000 jobs would disappear, that he had just been twisted in knots over these lost jobs, and that's why he and the Prime Minister took the extraordinary step of intervening 20 times with the Attorney General to have the charges set aside. And then when we asked, well, where did you get this idea that the 9,000 jobs would vanish? Oh, nothing specific.
Crazy.
Then we asked Michael Wernick, the clerk of the Privy Council, who has his hands on every briefing note that moves around the ministry. Do you have any report or document you can table with the committee showing that 9,000 jobs would vanish? No. All right, so there's no documented evidence, there's no specific information, there's no proof whatsoever that these jobs would vanish, and yet the whole justification for the government's interference in this file was that these jobs were at stake. Well, the jobs were never at stake. We found that out 10 days ago when the CEO of the company came out and said he never threatened 9,000 jobs or a headquarters move, and we know that he can't move the jobs out of the country because because construction jobs are done at construction sites, and you can't move a construction site. A construction site happens where the construction is being done. And, for example, SNC-Lavalin will be involved in the construction of a transit project that will go from right around this area out to South Ottawa. It's about a dozen kilometers or so of track that will be going out to the south end of this city, into my riding. Now, last time I checked, you can't build a rail system in Beijing, carry it by helicopter, and drop it from the sky on the nation's capital. The work will be done here. And so will the work on the $52 billion worth of projects that the company has in this country. It has the 5 biggest construction projects in Canada. And those jobs have to be done here in the country. They can't be shipped abroad, and that's where they will be done. Now, to suggest otherwise is a complete falsehood. And the final falsehood in this whole jobs fantasy is that the company will automatically lose its ability to bid on federal contracts if it's convicted. Well, we now know that's not true. In fact, one of the very first acts this Liberal government undertook when taking office was to extend an exemption to the bidding ban to SNC-Lavalin. The company was allowed to continue bidding on federal work, even though it had been charged with fraud and bribery. On December 8, 2015, the Deputy Minister of Public Works issued that exemption, and the company has continued to bid on, and I believe even successfully won federal contracts since being charged. The cabinet is now reviewing the bidding ban policy, and it has it in its power to ensure that SNC gets an exemption to a bidding ban, even if convicted. In other words, the reason I get into this technicality of this is that we keep being told that the reason why the company needs to avoid going to trial is because it needs to be able to bid on federal contracts, and that if it gets convicted, it will lose that ability. But we know that's not true. So if it's not about protecting the company's ability to bid on federal work, if it's not about keeping the headquarters here, and it's not about job losses, what is behind this incessant desire to protect this corporation from criminal prosecution? It's just astounding the lengths to which this Prime Minister has gone in this matter. Like, you know, there are high-profile trials every day in every country. And in all of my time here, going back to 2004, I have never seen a Prime Minister become personally involved in any of them. It's just not done. You know, if somebody walked into any of our constituency offices, Mr. Speaker, and said that they were charged with a crime and wanted our political assistance to get out of the charges, we'd politely show them the door. Say, sorry, but you came to the wrong office. You need to go see a lawyer. You can defend your case in court before a judge and perhaps a jury, but I'm sorry, I can't help you. You've come to the wrong place. Why? Because we do not adjudicate criminal trials in a political setting. Right. We have courts for that. So the fact that this Prime Minister became embroiled in this particular criminal trial, the fact that he went to such lengths to execute a campaign of pressure on his Attorney General in order to set aside criminal charges is spectacularly unusual. Like, I would defy any member of this House to give me another example of where a Prime Minister has gotten involved in a criminal trial at all, let alone to this degree. I'm not speaking rhetorically about it. I'm literally asking members of the House of Commons. Feel free to heckle it out if you want. Heckle at me. Give me an example. List a trial. One. Dead silence. No one here can point to a single example of a Prime Minister or any politician getting involved to set aside criminal charges on anyone. It is just a spectacular act, a spectacular and bizarre act by a Prime Minister in this country.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader has a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite was challenging members to cite a Prime Minister, and you know, many of us, or I would reflect on Brian Mulroney and Kim Campbell, and maybe he could explain why it is Prime Minister Brian Mulroney mandated and instructed an Attorney General to do something.
I'll let the honourable member for Carleton continue. A point of order, the honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, because I've been waiting all day to ask questions of the member for Carleton, but he continues to speak. So I feel it's very unfair for the Liberals to use a point of order as an attempt to introduce a question into the House, and I think it's throwing off the member for Carleton. And if someone should be asking him a question first, I would prefer it, but I have enormous respect for this chamber, Mr. Speaker, so I would ask you to suggest that people wait until they have the opportunity to ask questions and let the member finish his discourse.
You've got a good point.
I'll remind the honourable members how the procedures work. Is the honourable member does have time remaining. He will continue. When he's done, he will have 10 minutes of questions and answers, or questions and comments. I'll let the honourable member for Carleton continue.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I did ask members of the House of Commons to give a single example of any Prime Minister that has interfered in a criminal prosecution. And the member got up across the way in a failed point of order, and not only did he fail procedurally, he failed factually. He tried to point to Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney never once interfered in the criminal prosecution of anyone, any person or any company. So there is no analogy to be drawn between this and that. In fact, he mentions David Milgaard. David Milgaard was prosecuted years before the Prime Minister ever took office. So the Prime Minister Mulroney ever took office. So it would be impossible to draw that same kind of linkage. There is no Prime Minister, at least in my lifetime, that has ever interfered in a criminal prosecution, ever, period. It's just not done.
That's right.
And I say that to illustrate the gravity of this scandal. As I was saying earlier, what distinguishes Canada from other places in the world is that we have liberty under the law. There is nothing unique or different about the air we breathe, the water we drink, or the ground we stand on, other than that we have liberty under the law, and so many places in the world do not. They live in lawless places where it's not the rule of law, it's the law of rulers. Yeah. In other words, there are arbitrary decisions by political leaders to decide who goes to jail and who does not. If we normalize the process of Prime Minister picking up the phone or going in person to top law officers and telling them who will be prosecuted and who will not, then we could slide down the slippery slope to those other places. And those are places around the world from which people flee to come here precisely because we have the rule of law. Exactly. And I am very blessed to represent many newcomers to Canada in my constituency, and they are particularly affronted by the political interference because they left places specifically because they wanted to get away from political leaders using their muscle to get a legal outcome for friends or foes. And if the Prime Minister of Canada believes he can do that with impunity, and if the Canadian people let him get away with it, then we are heading down a very dark and ugly path indeed. But it doesn't have to be that way. And here is the remedy I propose. 1, let us take the entire list of the players who interfered in this criminal trial and invite them to come to the committee, the Justice Committee. Let us swear them in under oath and have them testify. Let us, all members of all parties, pose questions to them, get answers on the record. And then let us write a full report issuing our findings to all Canadians. And let's do all of that before the next election so that Canadians can judge what happened here and decide if they're willing to allow the people who did it to continue to govern. Now, you'll notice in everything I just stated, I have been utterly neutral about the possible outcome of that Justice Committee investigation. I am leaving open the possibility that the Prime Minister could come before the committee and give brilliant testimony to explain away all of the contradictions that I have highlighted and all of the facts that the former Attorney General has put before the world. He could do that if he's telling the truth. If he's got nothing to hide, he will do that.
Yep.
And if, in fact, that really is the core of this discussion. They stood here, the Liberals came here and voted for 30 hours.
That's right.
Rather than letting us recommence the committee investigation into the scandal. Why? Yeah. Now they're requiring that I stay on my feet and speak for hour upon hour upon hour. Why? They are refusing again and again opportunities to have the committee continue and complete its investigation. Why? If members across the way, if the Liberal Prime Minister has nothing to hide, why not just let the committee complete its investigation? It would be a very easy thing to do. We could add extra hours to the committee's schedule to make sure it doesn't interrupt 1 minute of the committee's normal work plan, and we could find out exactly what went on. That's a very easy thing to do if you've got nothing to hide.
Exactly.
But then again, if you do have something to cover up, then you shut down the Justice Committee. And then a week and a half later, shut down the Ethics Committee. And then you make attacks on the character of the former Attorney General. And then you attack the former Treasury Board President, who also spoke out. And then you threaten that they might both be kicked out of a caucus altogether for blowing the whistle. That's what you do if you have something to hide. That is why we're calling it a cover-up. A cover-up, Mr. Speaker. Here in this House of Commons, we have the ability to uncover the truth.
That's right.
And that is the principal purpose of my intervention here today. You know, it was interesting when the Liberals stayed here, kept us here for 30 hours straight, voting on item after item after item of expenditure, because they refused to allow a committee investigation to proceed. They set up cots in the back behind the curtains there, so they could go sneak out and have a nap. And you know, I don't hold them.
Honourable member for Malpeque.
No, the member for Carleton is talking a lot of fiction here today, but Mr. Speaker, it wasn't the Liberals that kept us here. It was the Conservatives that kept us here, whereby they voted against every good program that was in the last budget.
Yep.
The honourable member for Carleton continue.
It was actually the estimates we were voting on, which is different than the budget, but that's just the Finance Committee chair. He doesn't need to know the difference, I guess, between the two. You know, we just got a budget from the other side of the House of Commons, which contained in it over $150 million worth of math mistakes. Now, the finance minister sent his officials out and say, "Oh, they were all typos," and we very quickly pulled out calculators and figured out, no, they weren't typos; they were in fact math errors. But you know, once again, he's just the finance minister. He doesn't need to be good at math, I guess. The finance committee chair doesn't need to know the difference between budget and estimates, and the finance minister doesn't need to know how to do arithmetic in this government. But the member has now distracted me from my train of thought, which was related to the evening of votes that the government forced upon the House of Commons. We were voting, of course, on billions of dollars of spending approvals, and Conservatives said, "Let's get out of here. Let's just agree that we're going to do a Justice Committee investigation to get to the bottom of the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal, and we can bundle all of these votes and go home." The government said, no, we're not going to allow an investigation, and so the Conservative opposition was required, as part of its duty, to keep the government here voting on one spending item after another. And in order to get through that 30 hours, the government set up these taxpayer-funded cots just behind the curtain over there. For those viewers out there, just beyond there, they had these cots where members could go and have a snooze between votes. So of course they had blankets, and what are blankets for? Well, to help you cover up. Yes. And then they came in here because they were so ornery and angry occasionally, and they blamed us that they couldn't get a night's sleep. And my advice to them is that the secret to a good night's sleep is a clear conscience.
Yes.
You want a good night's sleep? Have a clear conscience. You want a clear conscience? Tell the truth.
Yes.
Let it all out. Unburden yourself of all these falsehoods, because falsehoods are heavy things to carry around. And that is why the Prime Minister has looked so heavy lately.
Yes.
He's carrying a lot of falsehoods around, and they are like lead weights everywhere he goes,
Yeah.
and they're weighing on him.
That's right.
And if he would just stop the cover-up and end those falsehoods, he could move forward.
That's right.
Now, it is possible that the truth that he is covering up is so appalling that he could not be reelected. But I would submit to him that any electoral strategy that hinges on keeping ugly truths hidden is destined to fail.
That's right.
He is not going to be able to keep this all under wraps until after the election. He has people in his own midst who are accusing him of a cover-up. His former Treasury Board president, the person to whom he wisely entrusted the management of our entire public service and the approval of tens of billions of dollars of expenditure, has said there is a lot more to this story that has not been told, and that he is trying to shut down the debate on it. This is what liberals say about the Prime Minister. And so he can't simply dismiss these allegations as something that's coming from a politically motivated opposition. The two women who have resigned from his cabinet have gained absolutely nothing by doing so. Not that this would matter to them, but I think it's worth stating the obvious. They've taken major pay cuts. They've had their position reduced from minister to non-minister, which is a very big distinction in a parliamentary system where ministers are responsible for the executive governance of the country. None of that was to their benefit. We've heard a lot of people trying to attack the character of these two women, saying that they were being opportunistic by exposing this scandal. But I fail to see what they've gained. Like, what advantage has it conferred to them politically by telling these truths? Nothing. They've made immense personal sacrifice for blowing the whistle. One, they're no longer ministers, even though they're far more qualified than those who remain on the front bench. Two, they've come under attack, vicious, personal, sexist, and racist attacks from senior liberals. They've faced threats. As recently as yesterday, the employment minister had called the former attorney general unethical, and now the Liberal Party is threatening to throw them out of the caucus altogether. So, to suggest that these two former ministers were doing this to advance somehow their own political interests runs exactly counter to what happened. Right. It's very clear that though I obviously don't share the politics of either of them, I do clearly respect the conviction and principle that they have shown, and their willingness to sacrifice their own careers in order to stand up for the truth. And I think both of these women have more integrity in their pinky fingers than does the Prime Minister from head to toe. And if he disagrees with me on that, then he'll do what they've been willing to do. The former Attorney General came before the Justice Committee and testified, took a barrage of questions from the Liberal delegation, submitted 40 pages of written text messages and an audio recording, all of which confirm that she told the truth. You know what's interesting about all these people who are trying to discredit the former Attorney General? They can't point to a single falsehood she's told, even though she's tabled something like 40 pages of text messages and an audio recording. And even though the government has an army of spin doctors and dirt diggers and researchers to find any little hair that's out of place, the Prime Minister's team has not been able to find a single contradiction or a single falsehood in anything that the Attorney General has said so far. In fact, she is the one person at the heart of this whole controversy whose story has not once changed in any way, shape, or form. She's consistently told the same story over and over again. And when challenged, she provided text messages to support her claims. And when challenged again, she provided audio recordings. And all of that evidence precisely supports the claims that she made all along. Now, I'm not a trial lawyer, but I know one thing that trial lawyers, that judges and juries look for when they're determining who to believe is whose story's changing. You know, if one witness seems to change his story more often than he changes his colorful socks, and the other one has a single story that's set in stone and doesn't move and doesn't change, the wise judge or jury will believe the latter over the former. And that's why we as conservatives, having examined the evidence, have concluded that the former Attorney General has told the truth and that the Prime Minister has not. Now, that being said, we are so confident in our view of that we welcome the Prime Minister to prove us wrong. Come to committee, testify, under oath, put your hand in the good book, tell your story, answer questions. But so far, he's been unwilling to do that. It's like he's terrified that we might get too close to the truth, that we might find out the real reason he went to such lengths to protect this accused corporate criminal, that we might find out that, in fact, he stated a patent falsehood to Canadians when he claimed that the former Attorney General never raised any concerns about his interference in the matter, that we might find other falsehoods or expose bigger contradictions. And so his answer again and again is shut it all down. He shut down the Justice Committee, the Ethics Committee. Tomorrow morning he'll have a chance to change course. The Justice Committee will meet again. Now that we have new written evidence and recorded conversations which blow apart earlier claims by the Prime Minister and his team of witnesses, Conservatives will move to reopen the investigation and include all of the witnesses, all of the players who were at the heart of this scandal and who were alleged to have interfered with the work of the former Attorney General by pushing her to sign a special deal for SNC-Lavalin to avoid criminal trial. Now, I want to examine the merits of the Attorney General's original decision not to interfere. The Prime Minister chose to amend the criminal code through an omnibus bill in the budget, by which he created something called deferred prosecution agreements. The agreements, for those who are not familiar, provide that corporations facing criminal charges can avoid trial by fessing up, apologizing, paying a fine, and promising not to do it again. Factors that a Director of Public Prosecutions must consider to determine the eligibility of a company for a deferred prosecution include severity of the offense and whether or not the company self-reported its crimes. So let's review both of those issues. Let's start with whether the company self-reported. Turns out the company did not. Instead, the company did was it got caught when one of its senior employees was charged and ultimately convicted in Switzerland. And I'm going to read some excerpts from the Financial Post. According to police, Ben Aza, this is a former senior employee at SNC-Lavalin, established a scheme in which two companies, Devel Securities and De Novo International, billed SNC roughly $127 million for helping the firm win dozens of major contracts in Libya during the 2000s. In fact, Swiss and Canadian police say Devel and De Novo were shell companies controlled by Ben Aza. The money, including $1.5 million US dollars spent on a yacht for Saadi Gaddafi, was used to bribe Libyan officials and pad the bank accounts of Ben Aza and Mr. Babawi, who left SNC in 2006. I go on now to quote Global News. In Switzerland, an ex-employee from SNC-Lavalin pleaded guilty to fraud, corruption, and money laundering in relation to his business in Libya in 2014, before the RCMP charges. Riyad Ben Aza acknowledged in court that he bribed Saadi Gaddafi, son of Libya's late dictator Muammar Gaddafi, so SNC could win contracts. Now, it was out of these charges in Switzerland that the RCMP was able to ascertain the conduct of SNC-Lavalin, and therefore was able to bring forward allegations of fraud and bribery. So in other words, it wasn't that the company realized somebody did something wrong and then called the police and said, look, we've made a mistake, we want to self-report, please hold us accountable. The RCMP had to find out through Swiss proceedings that this corruption had occurred in order to launch its own investigation and lay its own charges. So the first criteria for getting a DPA, a deferred prosecution agreement, is not met. The next is the severity. Was the offense severe and broad, or was it a minor offense that could therefore better be treated through an administrative penalty rather than through a criminal court trial? So let's examine the charges that the company faces and determine if we think they are severe enough to warrant prosecution. Let me read again from Global News. In 2015, the RCMP charged SNC-Lavalin, along with its international division, with corruption and fraud in relation with business dealings in Libya. The RCMP said officials at the company attempted to bribe several public officials in the country, including dictator Muammar Gaddafi, as well as other businesses in Libya. RCMP, still quoting Global News, RCMP officials said SNC-Lavalin also lied to Libyan companies to defraud them of nearly $130 million. Now, the Financial Post, SNC and its subsidiaries, SNC-Lavalin Construction, Inc., and SNC-Lavalin International, are also alleged to have defrauded various Libyan public agencies of approximately $129.8 million. Let me stop on that point, because it has been said again and again, we hear it, It's been muttered under the breath of some liberals, you know, that what SNC did over in Libya, that's just the way business is done over there. And frankly, I find that kind of utterance despicable. That we think it okay for wealthy Western companies to go into poor developing nations where people live in squalor and rob them of $130 million just because that's the way things are done over there, you know, or that's how we have to behave, so goes the story, to be competitive in different parts of the world. These places are so poor precisely because businesses have thought it appropriate to conduct themselves in that way. The parasitical corruption that has afflicted many countries in the world is the reason why so many people still live in grinding poverty. You go to these poor countries and it is astonishing to see how hard people work. You go in the streets and people are always working. And you say to yourself, how is it possible that these people work so hard and yet they're so poor? And the answer is, in part, corruption. Because the labor of the people who are toiling away before our eyes is squandered by a corrupt and entitled elite that just suck the country of all of its wealth. And that parasitical conduct is not limited to people from those countries. In fact, often it's foreign interests that come in and take advantage of the opportunity to defraud. And we have signed on to international conventions against fraud and bribery precisely because foreign companies have gotten into the practice of going in, defrauding countries, and then getting the heck out because they knew they could never be prosecuted back home. They'd go home, they'd leave with all the cash that they stashed in their pockets, having plundered the people, and with no intention of ever going back, they know that they will never be prosecuted in the country where they carried out their misdeeds. That's why we've signed on to international conventions so that we could join with other countries in prosecuting corrupt corporate enterprises that rob people. Because we as a nation understand that it's not only a miserable way to make money, but it's an illegal way to make money by robbing the poor. And it is our duty, our moral duty, to prosecute this kind of corruption when it happens, even though it happens beyond our borders and even though we might not be ourselves the direct victims of the corruption itself. And so, no, it is not a small offense. It wasn't just that the SNC lobbyists and the people and insiders bribed the Gaddafis with prostitutes and yachts, as unseemly as that sounds. It's also that they are alleged to have robbed the people of that country of $130 million. And that is a lot of money, especially for a country that is suffering in poverty. A lot of good could have been done for the Libyan people if they had been able to keep their own money, had they not been defrauded by these alleged crimes. So no, it wasn't a frivolous offense for which the appropriate sentence is an administrative penalty. It is a serious crime to defraud people, and it should be treated as such by our legal system. Knowing all of this, it is astonishing that the Prime Minister would consider it such a top priority for him to help this Liberal-linked company avoid prosecution. So we've addressed the two first criteria upon which a deferred prosecution is supposed to be judged by the prosecutor and ultimately by the Attorney General. And on those two criteria, it's clear as day, the company did not qualify. Finally, there's a third criteria that I forgot to mention, and that is this an isolated incident? You know, we all understand that in our judicial system we have a principle of proportionality. Somebody makes a single mistake in their life. The judge will take that into consideration when issuing a verdict. The prosecutor, the Crown, might even take it into account when deciding whether or not to pursue the trial or to accept a more moderate plea bargain. So in this case, was this an isolated incident? Were there just a few bad apples in Libya that made some mistakes that are not part of a broader corporate corruption culture in the company? The answer, of course, is no. And just let me read some of the history that this company has been involved in. I'm going to quote now from Global News again. 3 top executives were also charged with bribery in relation to the McGill University Health Center. Former CEO Pierre Poilievre, along with McGill officials, pleaded guilty in the case. So this is the CEO. This is not some bad apple who off in a faraway land did some things unknown to anyone else. It was the CEO himself, and it was in relation to a contract with the McGill University Health Center. And then you have the Jacques Cartier Bridge. Quebec prosecutors are working with the RCMP on the possibility of new criminal charges against SNC-Lavalin tied to a contract to refurbish Montreal's Jacques Cartier Bridge, court document show. And that's a report from Global News. Again, Global News. In court documents, the RCMP lays out a bribery scheme involving $127 million Jacques Cartier Bridge contract in the early 2000s. Former federal official Michel Fournier pleaded guilty in 2017 to accepting more than $2.3 million in payments from SNC-Lavalin in connection with the project. This is an astonishing crime. It's a massive project, $127 million. And a federal official was paid $2.3 million in a bribe in order to get that contract. This is right here on our own home turf, which reminds us that the cost of corruption, corporate corruption, for this company is not limited to some faraway land. It is right here in our own country. You know, let me go on. I'm going to quote further Global News. In 2011, an SNC employee whose job was to facilitate travel of SNC employees in and out of Libya was arrested in Mexico and accused of attempting to smuggle Gaddafi's son and family out of the country. The employee was eventually released from jail and not charged in Canada. I mean, what is a Canadian construction company doing helping to smuggle the Gaddafis in Mexico? Like, it's just, you go from Montreal to Libya to Mexico, and everywhere this company seems to be involved in the most appalling and in some cases just downright bizarre forms of corruption. The company was also banned from bidding on projects by the World Bank for 10 years over alleged misconduct during a bridge construction contract in Panama. So now we have Panama, you know. So it's Libya, Montreal, Mexico, Panama. And SNC is in legal trouble in all of these places for the conduct in which it engages. And then we find here in an article, again by Global News, during an investigation from CBC and the Globe and Mail, it was alleged there was an internal accounting code for bribes. So this is just an example. Of how entrenched the corruption had become, that they actually had a system of codes that they could use in order to properly account for all of the bribery they were doling out. So on the third criteria to determine whether the company was entitled to a deferred prosecution agreement, that is, whether it's an isolated, the offense was an isolated incident, clearly it was in Montreal, it was in Libya, it was in Mexico, it was in Panama, it was right to the top with the CEO of the entire company. It seems everywhere you turn around, someone from SNC-Lavalin is being accused or charged or convicted or pleading guilty to high-level and serious corruption involving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So no, this is not simply an isolated incident. And so, and now we have a couple of sponsorships scandal era liberals heckling away on the other side about ethics. And now that I'm glad that we have some of those sponsorship liberals across the way, because it really is a full circle for this particular scandal, right? How did we find out about this scandal? Well, we learned about it because of a law that Stephen Harper put in place in response to the sponsorship scandal, the Accountability Act. Yeah. And the Liberal Party, according to Judge Gomery, had engaged in an elaborate kickback scheme funneling $40 million of cash, much of it still missing and never recovered, and some of it going right into the coffers of the Liberal Party itself. Paul Martin admitted that the Liberal Party stole at least $1 million. He gave the money back after he was caught. And we were struck by the fact that all kinds of people were charged for this fraud, but not the Liberal Party. And it occurred to us that the possible reason for that was that the Attorney General at the time was a Liberal. And the Attorney General's office was responsible for prosecuting federal offenses. So we wanted to make sure that never again could someone get off of a criminal prosecution because their friend or their party was in control of the office of the Attorney General. We created the Director of Public Prosecutions, a separate and independent office whereby a top respected prosecutor would have his or her own office and could operate with total independence from the political arm of government. So independent did we create this office that for the Attorney General to give any direction to the Director of Public Prosecutions, it must be in writing, and that written instruction must be reported publicly in something called the Gazette. That's a publication the government puts out to inform the public of decisions that have been made. So in other words, no pulling someone into your office and twisting their arm. It has to be in writing, and it has to be made public. And this, of course, is very inconvenient if you're trying to interfere in a prosecution, right? It just makes it a little bit difficult to keep it all under wraps. And here's where it gets really interesting. Gerald Butts told two different, according to text messages and sworn testimony by the former Attorney General, told two different people that he didn't want to respect that law because it was a Harper law. He thought, you know, Harper put it in, and therefore you don't have to respect it. He told that to staff members in the Attorney General's office, and he told it to the Attorney General herself. We have in the 40-page package she tabled with the Justice Committee on Friday, we have documented evidence that Gerald Butts did exactly that. And if he's listening, I hope he is bowing his head in shame for telling someone that they don't have to follow the law just because that law was put in place by a different political party and under a different government. That law was designed to protect the independence of our judicial and our prosecutorial system. And it is not to be tread upon just because of a partisan desire to get things done by going around the rules. So that's how we got here in the first place, is that, you know, we had a prime minister in Stephen Harper who was determined to root out corruption and protect the independence of prosecutions. He passed a law, the Accountability Act, to make sure that he put an end to corruption in the prosecution of crime, and guess what? It worked. It worked really well. And I see my Liberal friends across the way have gone silent since we've reminded them of that. And I think that is probably a wise decision for them indeed. And unfortunately, it was not a long silence. But that being said, an empty wagon rattles the loudest, Mr. Speaker. But the reality is that nothing has changed. Nothing has changed for the old entitlement Liberals. This is a party that seems to have an impossible time shedding itself of its core identity, which is one of entitlement, of stuffing your pockets with other people's money, of helping your friends, and of breaking the law. That's what they did under the sponsorship Liberals, and that's exactly what they're doing now. And I should mention that, as I was remiss earlier on, I thank the members across the way for reminding me that SNC-Lavalin gave about $100,000 of illegal donations to the Liberal Party. Money it funneled through the creation of phony invoices, phony expenses, and phony bonuses. Can you imagine the amount of coordination that must have been involved when the executives at that company actually told employees, we want you to make phony expense claims so that we can reimburse you, and then you can give that phony reimbursement in the form of a donation to the Liberal Party. For reasons unknown to me, when this fraud came to light, the Commissioner of Canada Elections decided to let the company and the Liberal Party off of trial or charges, and the company was simply given a slap on the wrist through a compliance agreement, whereby the money was returned and the company promised never to do it again. But once again, the company was able to avoid accountability for a serious breach of law. And that is very unfortunate indeed. But that being said, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't mean that accountability is over. The company, as it stands now, will face trial. As it stands now, they will face prosecution for fraud and bribery. I keep saying as it stands now because we don't know if the new Attorney General is going to make the decision to interfere in the criminal prosecution the way the former Attorney General refused to do. We know that he has an open mind to the idea. He has not made a decision. Now that in itself is very interesting because what it shows is that the shuffle did have, the cabinet shuffle of the former Attorney General out and the new Attorney General in had a material impact on the prospect of prosecution for the company. As of September 2018, it was the official position of the then Attorney General that the company would be prosecuted. That is no longer the case. Now, it is the official position of the Attorney General that the company might be prosecuted. In other words, he has left open the possibility of either taking over the prosecution himself in order to negotiate a deferred prosecution agreement, or of writing a directive to the Director of Public Prosecution ordering that she do so on behalf of the government. And it would be an extremely telling if after all of this, the government the Prime Minister were to get his way and have the company get off. Now, I suspect that is exactly what he plans. That if he is hoping and praying that he can put this scandal under the rug until the election is over, and in the first couple of weeks, out will come the special deal. And they'll do it early in the term just to make sure that everyone is forgotten by the subsequent election. Remember, December 8th, 2015, one of the very first acts of this government was to give SNC-Lavalin an exemption on a federal bidding ban that it had faced due to the fraud and bribery charges that it's contesting right now. It's December 8th, a special deal for SNC-Lavalin within weeks of this Prime Minister taking office. So we know it's always a priority for Liberals to help this company whenever they can. And don't be surprised, Mr. Speaker, if this Prime Minister gets back in office, it won't be 2 months. And this trial will be over, this company will have a special deal, a small monetary fine will be paid. The CEO will cry crocodile tears and promise never to do it again, and on we'll go. And the message will have gone out that if you're charged with a serious crime in Canada, your recourse is not to go to court and defend yourself with a lawyer in front of a jury and a judge. Your recourse is to hire an army of lobbyists